Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me warmly welcome you on behalf of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium and the Migration Research Institute at today's event entitled Immigration Reloaded, Biden's Plans and Results 1 Year After. It is my pleasure to introduce you our guest from the US, Mr. Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Washington-based think tank Center for Immigration Studies. Today, we will talk about the general immigration situation of the United States with particular attention to the performance of the Biden administration. And at the beginning of the event, just one technical information. Please let me encourage you to ask questions from Mr. Krikorian by using the so-called Slido platform. Here you can see the access code. If you use it, you can ask questions, and at the end, I will pose them to Mr. Krikorian. So, my first question would be, generally speaking, what does immigration mean to your country?
Well, that's a big question. We only have 58 minutes left, so I'll give a short answer. There has been this idea that's developed over the past 60, 70 years, developed ideologically, that the United States is a nation of immigrants, but just a nation of immigrants. In other words, that's America's kind of primary identity. It's based on the title comes from a book that Jack Kennedy wrote before he was president, when he was still in the Senate, called A Nation of Immigrants, except that even the book wasn't what people have made it out to be, because what President Kennedy wrote in the book, or Senator Kennedy at the time, John Kennedy, was that immigration was a very important part of our history and that we have now moved beyond the phase of mass immigration. But it's been used as a sort of an ideological crowbar to pry open the borders, because it's been presented as, in a sense, almost part of the Constitution to have mass immigration, when in fact immigration is an important part of America's development. But, you know, the original settlers and colonists weren't immigrants. They had to come and create, as Sam Huntington wrote, you had to have settlers to create a society for immigrants then to be able to come and follow them. So it's not really, I guess, it's not like the yin and the yang of Eastern philosophy, but it's a similar idea that the focus on immigration in America's identity is real, but it has been exaggerated to the detriment of the rest of the component parts of America's identity. I can go on for 57 more minutes, but I figure you have a few more questions.
Yeah, prepared with some others as well. And what are the main consequences of mass immigration to the U.S., if we can call today's immigration processes, developments, as mass, and categorize them as...
Well, it's definitely mass immigration. I mean, in a regular year, last year was different because of COVID, but in a regular year, we give permanent legal immigration status to 1 million or more people, and take in another 1/2 or 3/4 of a million so-called temporary workers, many of whom aren't temporary at all. I mean, the joke is there's nothing as permanent as a temporary worker. But, so it's a very high level of immigration. And the effects of it are different from what they were 100 or 200 years ago. Too many people, even those who are skeptical of immigration, identify the problem as being that the immigrants are somehow different from their grandparents or great-grandparents. You'll hear this from well-meaning people, but they'll say, you know, my grandpa from Sicily didn't use welfare. What's wrong with people today? They're all, because half of immigrant households are using welfare. They're working, but they're getting welfare. The fact is, your grandpa from Sicily came to a country where there was no welfare. So, in other words, what's different about the impacts of mass immigration is us, or America anyway, I guess not all of us, but the United States is different in a whole variety of ways. We have a knowledge-based post-industrial economy in a way that was, you know, again, not the case in the past. People were working in factories and farms before. That was the basis of the economy. We have a welfare state that we didn't have before. We have a leadership class that doesn't believe in assimilating newcomers. Again, very different from before. The analogy I used in the book I wrote on this subject a while back that my editor took out, so I always have to bring it up just to make sure to get back at her. Hi, Bernadette. Is to donuts. When you're 7 years old, donuts are good for you. You need the fat, you need the calories, your body, your brain are all growing. Donuts are good. When you're 57 years old, you can't eat donuts the way you used to eat them. The donuts are the same, you're different. You're not sick or broken, you've just changed. Your metabolism has changed. The metabolism of the body politic has changed such that mass immigration is much more problematic now than it was in earlier phases of immigration.
And what do ordinary American citizens think about it, and politicians?
It's a good question. There's both for politicians and for ordinary voters, neither one of whom thinks about the immigration issue very much, even if we're paying them to think about it. Politicians usually don't. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance, there's a tension in people's minds, because they are concerned about immigration, but their grandpa was an immigrant, and so how can they be against it? You know, there's a sort of, almost kind of like a lot of people feel guilty about being concerned about immigration. And the way that's often resolved is that people will say, illegal immigration is bad, but legal immigration is good. And if you think about it a little bit, it kind of falls apart. Not because there's no difference. I mean, the part of illegal immigration is that it's illegal. I mean, that's obviously a real part of it. But all the other things that people are concerned about with regard to immigration, whether it's impact on less skilled, the wages of less skilled workers, welfare, assimilation, what have you, they're the same between legal and illegal immigrants. It's a coping mechanism almost. I remember there was a politician, a congressman actually, Sonny Bono. He was, you know, Sonny and Cher from a long time ago. I don't know if anybody even remembers him, but he actually was elected to Congress, which is improbable enough as it is. But he was on the immigration subcommittee in the House of Representatives, and his kind of facile way of responding to it was, what part of illegal do you not understand in responding? And we can make fun of Sonny Bono, and probably even deserved it, but what he was saying is the kind of thing that lots of politicians and even ordinary voters think. In other words, that's how they respond, that's how they reconcile the two issues. You know, their concern about immigration, but also their respect for their grandparents. And it doesn't work, it's not sustainable. But nonetheless, that kind of illegal bad, legal good perspective has driven too much of immigration politics. I think that's changing somewhat, but that really does underlie a lot of the politics on immigration over the past, say, 30 or 40 years.
And is there any meaningful debate on the issue of immigration in the US, both on the level of the society and the political elite?
No. What's debate? I mean, if there were, the center would be out of business. I mean, there are some people, obviously, who are raising concerns. But even Donald Trump, in kind of forcing discussion of the issue, was focusing mainly on illegal immigration issues. I mean, you know, Donald Trump was not a restrictionist. Donald Trump was a legal good, illegal bad guy. In other words, he just put it in a more kind of boorish and in-your-face fashion. But his perspective really wasn't that different from a regular Republican politician who talks about we need to have a tough border enforcement to satisfy public concerns, but then takes the check from the lobbyists to keep legal immigration and guest worker programs going. So I forgot what the question was now. What was the, because this happens to me. I love to hear the sound of my own voice. But what was the? I
asked whether there's any.
Oh, whether there's any debate. No, too much of, I mean, there is debate, but too much of it is just about, do we need a wall, do we not need a wall? That's sort of relatively superficial, first level issues, not a more fundamental debate yet about, or do we really need to be taking 1 million people every year? I mean, the United States spans an entire continent. We have 1/3 of a billion people. We invented the modern world. We don't really need to be taking 1 million people every year for our society to function. The debate, sort of that more fundamental debate, is starting, but it's still only in its beginning stages.
And today, speaking about today, how serious is the problem of illegal immigration to your country? Has the COVID pandemic worsened or improved the situation?
Probably improved it a little bit in the sense, I mean, illegal immigration is a big deal. I mean, last year, fiscal year 2021, meaning it ended for whatever reason, I've never understood this, our fiscal year ends September 30th. There were the largest number of arrests ever in any fiscal year ever recorded, almost 1.7 million on the southern border specifically. In the calendar year, in other words, from January to December, so we're including almost all of it under Biden, there was something like almost 2 million arrests. Now, some of those people were the same people arrested several times, but of those 2 million people, the Biden administration released into the United States more than 700,000 of them. Those people will never be leaving. Very few of them will get asylum formally, but even when they're turned down, they'll just stay. So it's clearly a serious issue. That what COVID did, though, was give the Trump administration the opportunity to use an existing authority in the law when there is a public health emergency that's been declared. The Border Patrol is permitted to just turn people around and send them back across the border to Mexico without their being able to apply for asylum. So under Trump, that was widely used. Under Biden, it's still being used. He hasn't gotten rid of it altogether. He's made more and more exceptions, so it's not as large a percentage of the illegal immigrant flow that is being subjected to this. Technically, it's called Title 42 expulsions. But it has been a useful tool in limiting, sort of preventing illegal immigration from clogging up the immigration court system because they're not even allowed to apply for asylum. The problem is it's not sustainable. This administration is at some point going to have to end that public health emergency order, and then what are they going to do? Then they're going to have even more people who are going to say the magic words of asylum that they're coached to say by their smugglers, and they're going to end up having to let them in. In fact, we published something, I don't know, maybe it's a month ago now. One of our analysts went down to southern Mexico just to sort of do some general reporting on what was going on. And he walked walked on the street, and there was this sign that said psychological services. It was in Spanish. And he was like, what psychological service? What is that about? So he went and interviewed the director of this volunteer nonprofit group funded by the UN. They do recovered memory therapy, where illegal immigrants who are applying for asylum in Mexico as a way to enable them to legally travel through Mexico to get to the U.S. They don't necessarily want to stay there, but they want to be able to legally go all the way to the United States border. If they're turned down for asylum, they go to this center and meet with a psychologist who coaxes out of them the memories that they have suppressed about how they were persecuted. And then they literally go, and the psychiatrist, or a psychologist, it's not a doctor, accompanies them to the Mexican asylum office. They have their appeal, 90% plus then win their appeals because of these supposedly repressed memories. So it's, if they get rid of this Title 42 authority where they can turn people around, it's going to get a whole lot worse because these people then use those newly discovered memories of persecution to then apply in the U.S. for asylum too. If it worked in Mexico, let's try it again in the United States.
If you had to describe those people who are attempting to enter into the U.S. From the south, from Mexico and other Latin American countries, how would you describe these people? Who are these people?
Well, they're the same kind of people migrants are in general, in the sense that whether it's now or 300 years ago, migrants usually are not the poorest of the poor. They're people who are a step or two up from the bottom because they have they can rub two nickels together to pay because there's still costs involved, smugglers and what have you. or maybe they have like a little bit of land that they can then borrow money against. So they're poor, but they're usually not the poorest of the poor. They have a little bit of get up and go. And one thing that is different about the migration flow we're seeing now is that our law gives particular preference and benefits to illegal immigrants who bring children with them. So that while the earlier kind of migration across the border, illegal migration, was mainly just Mexican adult men coming to work in U.S. jobs. That's not the case anymore. There's still Mexicans coming over, but now it's much broader. It's coming from not just Central America, but all over both the Western Hemisphere and even the Eastern Hemisphere. One of our analysts was down in Costa Rica, and he ran across a whole group of Mauritanians sneaking through and coming up to the U.S., but also lots more children than there would have been otherwise. Mostly teenagers, but some younger, people under 18, because we have inadvertently created a kind of a magnet where if you bring someone under 18 years old with you, that kid is almost a golden ticket to be released into the United States. And people respond to incentives. We're giving them this incentive, people are acting on it. So the issue really is not that the people coming over are somehow uniquely bad. Yes, some of them are criminals. All of these things happen. That's real. But for the most part, they're just regular people. We are giving them an incentive to sneak into the United States because it's basically a kind of lottery. And it's a much better lottery than playing the regular lottery. You may have a 1 in a million chance to win something in the actual lottery. If you come to the border, you may have a 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4 chance of being released into the United States. And under this administration, certainly, no one's going to look for you. So you're home free. And by the time there's a new administration 3 years from now, a lot of these people will have had 1 or 2 children. They'll have established themselves. They'll, joined a church. They may even have bought a house. And then the very people who are causing this problem are going to say, well, you can't deport them now. We have to let them stay. So it's so again, the problem is not really that the immigrants are somehow a uniquely different flow. They're regular people. The problem is us in incentivizing and allowing this flow of illegal immigrants.
And what happens to those who can make it to the U.S.? Do they get a job later or establish a family or become part of the local community? What is the general
yes,
pattern?
To all of the above. I mean, they're coming to work for the most part. And most illegal immigrants already have some relative or friend or something here in the United States. Because nobody just wakes up in Uruguay and says, today I'm going to move to Wisconsin. I mean, it doesn't happen like that. Migration follows networks, and so all of these people have at least friends, if not relatives. And in fact, a lot of the underage immigrants, the so-called unaccompanied minor immigrants, none of whom are unaccompanied, they are almost all of them have relatives in the United States, usually their parents, who were illegally immigrated but left the kid back home with grandma and grandpa. And they see the opportunity to effect family reunification through illegal immigration. And so they pay a smuggler to bring the person up to the border. They step over the border on their own, so they're unaccompanied, but they have their parents' phone number and everything with them. And then the United States government delivers them at U.S. taxpayer expense to their relatives in the United States, in a sense, becoming a co-conspirator. The government is a co-conspirator in the smuggling process because half or more of that distance that's covered by the illegal immigrant is courtesy of the United States taxpayer. I know it's hard to believe, but...
Well, maybe something we could read about that. And what were the key promises of Biden in his presidential campaign in the field of migration?
Right. Basically, anything the bad orange man did, I'm going to undo, is what he said. That was what it amounted to. I mean, and that's even more broadly than immigration. I think the opposition to Trump had gotten so deranged that if he had said it's good to take a shower every day, his opponents would have stopped bathing just because Trump said it was good. I mean, it's that pathological. On immigration, it was basically everything Trump did was bad. Trump is evil. It's, you know, one step short of Nazism at the border, you know, that kind of thing. And so Biden pledged to undo everything Trump did. He hasn't totally followed through on undoing everything, but he undid, both in a practical sense and in a rhetorical sense, much of what Trump did. Biden had said that he would not tear down any of the wall that Trump built, because a lot of the people on the left, and I don't mean the real crazies, but even the only half crazies, actually wanted, I mean, the ACLU, for instance, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a pretty mainstream, I guess if you want to call it that, organization on the left, were demanding that the border wall be dismantled. And Biden still had enough presence of mind to say, no, we're not going to do that. But he did stop work on the wall immediately. And immediately, I mean, like when they issued the executive order, that was an order to the construction people to literally put down their tools that moment and step away, which meant that they now have holes in the fence. There are places where they were building wall from one side of a hill to the other, and they were going up, and then they just stopped. So we went and visited a ranch where there was a 3/4 of a mile, whatever that is, what is that, a 1.5 kilometers or something, hole, gap in the wall that funnels all the traffic right through there. There was another place we saw in New Mexico where there's a doorway. They have to put doorways periodically in the border fence so that there's a boundary commission, a U.S.-Mexico official boundary commission. They have to be able to get to and inspect these border markers. There's physical markers on the border, the land part of the border. It says, you know, this is the, in Spanish and English, this is the, demarcates the boundary of the United States and Mexico. So they have to be able to get to that. So they have to put these gate things, a doorway with a gate. Well, we saw at least one, and there were more, where they put the doorway in, and then they had to stop work. So there's no gate. There's just this opening in the fence. So Biden did that, and only a year later did they finally say, well, maybe we should at least put the gate in the doorway. He also ended something called the Remain in Mexico program, where a significant portion of illegal immigrants who snuck across and claimed asylum were made to wait on the Mexican side of the border for their hearing date to arrive. Because the point of applying for asylum for most of the people doing it is just to gain access, physical access to the United States. And then they can work, and they can, you know, join their family members, they can enroll the kids in school, and they know they're not going to be deported anyway, because that's the other thing that this administration did, is essentially stop deportations of illegal immigrants from inside the country. The way the president presented it during the campaign was they were going to focus their resources on deporting criminals and not regular people. Well, first of all, almost no regular people were deported. Even under Trump, almost everybody who was deported was either a convicted criminal or had been arrested on criminal charges. So there weren't that many non-criminals who were being deported anyway. What's happened under Biden is that compared to 2019 numbers, in other words, before COVID, deportations have dropped 90%. And even deportations of criminals dropped by something like 2/3. So it's not even as though they were putting all the resources into finding more criminals to deport. They're not even deporting as many criminals as they were before. Again, he promised stopping deportations in effect, and that's basically what he's delivered on.
And what about this amnesty issue? Because he promised to legalize the status of nearly 11 million illegal migrants.
The president, even during the campaign, didn't claim he could do that on his own. He said that's what he wanted to do, because that could only happen if Congress, a formal amnesty can only happen if Congress votes on it. And the White House did introduce legislation to amnesty all illegal immigrants. In fact, it was so, the bill they introduced, it was so over the top that it was dead on arrival. Everybody acknowledged it, because it would have given amnesty. legal status, permanent legal status, with a path to citizenship, to every illegal immigrant in the United States as of 3 weeks before he was sworn into office, as of January 1st of 2020. Everybody who'd come in before that would be able to get amnesty. And there would be no enforcement provisions to serve as kind of an offset or a balancing, which is kind of a false balance anyway, but even for show, they didn't even pretend that they were going to enforce the law in the future. He introduced that, but that wasn't going to go anywhere. What the Democrats in Congress have tried to do is move smaller amnesties tacked onto budget bills. But because of the rules in the Senate, they have been stymied over and over again because they're considered not germane, not relevant as budget matters, so that they can't add it to budget bills. So there isn't going to be any amnesty passed by Congress anytime soon. And the Democrats are going to lose the House of Representatives in the November elections anyway, and that guarantees there isn't going to be any amnesty. And, you know, to be fair to the president, that wasn't going to happen anyway. I mean, I think the anti-borders activists who were angry and frustrated about that, they were expecting too much. I mean, there was no way the president was going to be able to do that. That was more an aspiration that he wanted to bring about. And he would have, I mean, he's for it. I'm not saying he's against it, but he was never going to have the power to do that.
And generally speaking, are the Democrats united behind Biden's ideas and plans on immigration?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And that's a change from not that many years ago. It used to be that the Democrats were always more permissive on immigration than Republicans, at least on the illegal immigration issue. That's not new. But there was always some difference of opinion. There were always some Democrats, often labor-oriented Democrats from social democratic concerns, you know, for workers, or people motivated by environment and population issues. In other words, that immigration was driving population growth and causing more development than otherwise would happen. There was always some difference of opinion on the left. Those dissenters no longer exist, or at least they no longer feel comfortable speaking openly. Open borders has become a non-negotiable position on the left, such that even interest groups that don't work in immigration, they have different concerns, whether it's civil liberties, interests of black workers, unions, whatever it is. Anytime their concerns and their constituencies conflict with unlimited immigration, immigration wins. They sacrifice the interests. Just one example on this that I just find so absurd that it really illuminates this. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, is famous for defending free speech even of people and organizations that it finds repellent. And back in I think it was in the 70s, some neo-Nazis were marching through a suburb of the city of Chicago. It was called Skokie, which was heavily Jewish. And so this was an intentional provocation. The city government was trying to not give them a permission to march. The ACLU defended the Nazis, saying that, you know, as long as there's no violence here, they have to be allowed to do their march. So that's the background. That's what the ACLU used to be. Fast forward, a number of years ago, I forget exactly when this was, it was a little while, maybe 10, maybe 15 years ago, an immigration activist, kind of a little bit of a gadfly, but he wasn't a kook, had put billboard up in New York City with a picture of a couple of children saying, "Immigration will double America's population in our lifetime." Something like, is that a good idea? You know, go to projectusa.org or something like that. So it's not a provocative thing. It was just a sort of a conversation starter. The city government of New York went to the owner of that billboard and they said, "You're taking that down or we are coming after you." So it's explicit attempt to censor political speech. The activist who did it went to the ACLU, the one, remember, that defended Nazis waving their obscenities in the faces of Holocaust survivors, asking for help in this case of explicit political censorship. And they said, well, yeah, but we have immigrant rights people in our organization, so we're going to have to pass. You're on your own. That's how bad things have been. And that's the way it is with every interest on the right, whether it's the Black Caucus, whether it's labor unions, whether it's environmental groups. Anytime their interests, their ostensible concerns, conflict with unlimited immigration, immigration always wins. And that's a relatively new thing, that radicalization. There were always radical people on the left on immigration who rejected America's borders, basically, but that has now become the mainstream position. So that it is now essentially the official position of the Democratic Party that the American people don't really have the right to say no to anyone.
What are the key arguments of the Republican Party?
Depends who you're talking about, because the Republican Party actually is divided on immigration. And the divide, which still exists, I think it's the more hawkish, pro-enforcement immigration skeptics have become stronger within the party, but the division still exists between, on the one hand, those who you could accurately describe as actual conservatives, who are concerned about national sovereignty, the effect on American workers and American taxpayers. They want more control and, generally speaking, less immigration, although some of them haven't thought through fully the issue of legal immigration, but they're tougher on immigration. The other side, very influential in the Republican Party, is business interests and libertarians and the people who ideologically believe the government doesn't have the right to keep anybody out. And, or, as I said, business interests that have a financial interest in continued arrival of cheap labor. Both of those factions exist in the Republican Party. Generally speaking, the way traditionally they have resolved that is they talk tough at election time on enforcing the border and then make sure that enforcement doesn't really happen once the election is over. Trump started to change that, and I think maybe even before Trump that started to change. Trump was more a symptom of the dissatisfaction of regular Republican voters with their leadership, which was much too beholden to financial interests, or even in some cases ideologically beholden to a libertarian view. For instance, Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House, was not, he was more ideologically opposed to border control rather than just a matter of money. You know, that the financial supporters of the party wanted immigration to continue. That's true, that's definitely there. But in Paul Ryan's case, he believed in principle in not enforcing borders. And so that perspective, I think, has become is becoming marginalized among Republicans, but it's still there, it's still strong, because money isn't everything in politics, but money is important. And the money, everybody who makes money off of immigration makes money off of more immigration, not less immigration.
If you look at the economy, the labor market of the US, is the import of immigrants justified or rational?
No. We have the smallest percentage ever of working age Americans who are working. The percentage of work, especially, and when you look at what they call prime age men, between 25 and 55, I think is what they define prime age. And again, men who are more likely, they're not staying at home to take care of the kids. That percentage has been going steadily down. And when the economy picks up, it may go up a little bit, but it never goes back to where it was even just a few years ago. So the idea that we don't have enough people, this is what business lobbyists say, well, we're running out of people. Well, how about we try to draw into the labor market the enormous number of people, I mean literally tens of millions of working age people who not only don't have jobs, but aren't even looking for jobs. Now, part of that is the fault of the government, probably, because we're paying people not to work often. I mean, there are problems with the welfare state in encouraging dependency and what have you. But it's a broader social problem than that. We have come to devalue blue-collar jobs very often, and sort of that's seen as, you know, it's a work Americans won't do, which is generally nonsense, because almost every job that people say, well, this is a job Americans won't do, it turns out that most of the people doing them are people born in the United States. So there really is no such thing as that. Nonetheless, there is a broad, especially on the part of our leadership classes, this broad sense that Americans are either too good or too stupid and lazy to do all the kind of blue-collar jobs that are necessary for any society to function. And so immigrants have to be brought in to do them. But absolutely, we're nowhere near running out of people or running out of workers. But it probably is true that any given immigrant may well be a better worker than an American who doesn't have a job and hasn't been working for many years. In other words, if you're an employer, it's not that immigrants are better workers than Americans. It may well be, though, that at any given time, the people who are left for you to choose from who aren't already working in a job, that the immigrants might be better workers than the American, you know, who's, say, a recovering addict or an ex-convict or something like that. But those Americans who may well have problems, who may well have human capital problems, in other words, they may not be that great workers, they're still our people. They're not going anywhere. So what we need to do is have a tight labor market so that business and government and educational institutions, et cetera, have no choice but to come up with ways of enticing people, whether it's not just higher pay, but enticing people. For instance, there are a lot of programs for, they're called prisoner reentry programs. So people finish their terms in prison to help them re-enter normal society and rebuild their lives. And there's a lot of programs like that, and it's God's work, because you're trying to help people, remake their lives. Well, the people doing it are doing it out of altruism for the most part. There'd be a lot more people doing it if you didn't have anybody else to choose from. You, as a businessman, you'd have a lot more incentive in hiring an ex-con who wants to rebuild his life, or a recovering drug addict who wants to start again. What incentive do you have if there's plenty of immigrant workers willing to do that work? Some, you may do it just because you feel it's the right thing to do, but it's always good to make sure that there's a financial interest in doing the right thing so that you're reinforcing that. And what immigration does by loosening the labor market makes it possible for employers not to have to deal with workers, potential workers, that they would rather not deal with. And those workers are Americans, and we need to make sure that they are gainfully employed, both because it's the right thing to do and because as a society we shouldn't have tens of millions of people who are just not working and not engaged in the labor market. It's not healthy.
You mentioned blue-collar jobs, but to what extent can we talk about the brain drain in the case of migration to the United States?
So it's a real thing in higher skilled jobs. Much of what passes for skilled immigration in the United States isn't really all that skilled. A lot of them going to the tech industry, for instance. It's not that they're uneducated, but most of the tech workers that we import through various visa programs and what have you are in the bottom half of the skill distribution that our labor department classifies jobs into. So many of these so-called skilled immigrants aren't even all that skilled, really. But obviously, if you're poaching nurses and doctors from developing countries, that's not doing them much good. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, there's a moral argument against that, and I agree with it, but I've just never seen that as being politically all that effective. For instance, the majority of doctors born in Mali, and I remember Mali just because somebody did the numbers on this. Majority of physicians, medical doctors who were born in Mali are not in Mali. They're in France or in the United States, they're somewhere else. That's not good for Mali. On the other hand, is that really going to change votes in the United States, or in this case in France or anywhere else? No. So yes, brain drain is a problem, but concern over brain drain I do not think is going to have any political effect on changing immigration policies.
And what kind of policy should the administration pursue in the key sending countries in Latin America, or towards the key sending countries?
The Biden administration has talked about addressing the root causes of immigration, and it's become kind of a punchline, a joke in the United States, because the person he put in charge of root causes is Vice President Harris, who herself is something of a punchline. And even taking it sort of at face value, there's two problems with it. One, it's not going to work. If we knew how to develop less developed countries, then we wouldn't have any less developed countries. I mean, we've been giving development assistance for, what now, 50 years, 60, 70 years? It probably doesn't work. It may do more harm than good for all we know. The point is, it's not as though in any, reasonable period of time, in any predictable way, we can say, okay, we're going to give this money and this is going to have the effect of reducing migration. So that's the first point. Second point is, even if development assistance worked, it would actually spark more immigration initially, because as a country begins to develop, the pressures to emigrate increase initially until it reaches a certain level of development, at which point then emigration would decrease. So even on its own terms, it can't work in any short period of time. And the third problem is, the source countries of this illegal immigration are not diversifying. It's not just Mexico. It's not even just the 3 northern countries of Central America. We're seeing now an increasingly large percentage of people coming from Haiti, from Cuba, from Nicaragua, from Ecuador, from Brazil, and increasingly now from Mauritania and Pakistan and Uzbekistan and you name it. Well, are we supposed to solve everybody's root problems before we enforce our immigration laws? I mean, at some point, was it John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead? At some point, we need to start enforcing our own immigration laws and not just hope that if we invest enough money in streetlights in El Salvador, that somehow that will cause people to stop wanting to come. That's a political message, a way of the administration wants to seem responsive to concerns over the disaster at the border without actually having to do anything that would fix the disaster at the border.
Do you see any meaningful differences between the migratory situation in the US and in Europe? Can you compare them anyhow, in any respect?
Yeah, I think the fundamental similarity is that in both Europe and in the US, the core problem, weakness, or vulnerability is asylum policy. Asylum was something invented 70 years ago in the wake of World War II. Germany was still in ruins, and we signed the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees. The United States didn't actually sign that. It signed the corollary that came out in 1967. But the point is, that's the asylum system. When that asylum system was created, it was seen as a narrow little exception. It's Russian ballerinas and, a few other people. I mean, in the wake of World War II, there were displaced persons, but that kind of worked itself out in a few years. And subsequently, it was just some defectors from communist countries, and that's about it. It was seen as a small exception to immigration policy. That exception has now swallowed the entirety of the immigration system, so that claiming asylum is now one of the main ways that you come to Europe or the United States. And until the asylum, we rethink the way we do asylum. And I would say rethink even the concept of non-refoulement, of not returning people. Until we do that, neither the United States nor Europe is going to be able to fix things. I mean, you're not going to be able to get control of it because asylum is a fundamental vulnerability, a threat to the sovereignty of developed countries. As far as the differences go, the one big difference that struck me that I really hadn't thought about this way, and this was something that was brought to my attention by your colleague, Christoph Veres, who's a visiting fellow in Washington at our center. I always thought that the water border that the Mediterranean Sea represented was a better buffer, a more effective barrier than the land border we have with Mexico. And Christoph said, and he's writing something on this, it's like, no, it's the opposite. Because a land border, you can always just dump the person back across the border. In the Mediterranean, as long as the raft that alien smugglers are using is more than 3 miles out from the coast, it's in international waters, they can then flip it over, and the NGOs and others that have boats there waiting will pick everybody up, and then Europeans are stuck with them. So, because you can't let them drown, I mean, we're not going to do that. On a land border, you don't have that problem. You just, nobody's drowning, you just pick them up and you toss them back across the border if that's what you want to do. So that's actually a big difference, I think. The other difference, of course, is that the United States, borders on Latin America. And while distance is less important than it used to be, it still matters that Europe is next to Africa and the Middle East, and the United States isn't. It's just harder to get here from Afghanistan than it is to get to the United States from Afghanistan than it is to get to Hungary from Afghanistan. So, the kind of tongue half in cheek, the way I put it, is that the United States is in trouble, but everybody else is in worse trouble than we are on migration, and that we are, in a sense, the image is we're the healthiest horse in the glue factory. We still, we have real problems, but everybody else's problems with regard to migration, I think, are even worse than ours. Except Canada, because they have the whole United States as their buffer from the rest of the world. Everyone else is in big trouble.
I'm quite sure that you have some information about Hungary's migratory policy witnessed over the recent years. How do you see, can it be a model country for the US in any respect, or these experiences cannot be used in your country?
Yeah, I don't think in specifics, maybe, probably not, but the thing we can, I think, take from Hungary is the will to enforce the rules, because it seems that especially since the 2015 debacle, that a consensus has developed, a pretty wide consensus in favor of real immigration control. That we don't really have in the United States that much. I mean, there's real division on that. As far as the specifics, it's different. I mean, the United States is always going to have some significant level of immigration. Hungary's organized in a different way. It's an ethnic country instead of a constitutional, a civic nationalist country like the United States. So I would say no, not in specifics, but in the idea of commitment to enforcing the rules. The one thing I would point to that we might be able to learn is that I've been to the border fence down by Serbia several years ago, and it's electrified. And there are signs on there warning people in every different language not to touch. And when I talked to them, they said, yeah, it's not really that electrified. It's really just a sensor so that when you touch it, they can tell where it's been touched. In other words, it's not like Jurassic Park where, it scares people off. And so if we could do that kind of very mild electrification of our border fence, that I would take as a lesson that might work. Other than that, no.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to get in trouble probably for saying that, but that's okay.
Thank you. That's with what we were prepared for today, but luckily we have some questions from the audience. Let me ask you the first one. Do you consider mass immigration a concern to US culture and thus to the identity of the nation, which is already highly fragmented because of internal issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Although, let me point out, I'm not sure, it's not really that the immigration is driving the fragmentation. The fragmentation is there, the immigration is exacerbating it. The problem, though, is a deeper one, that if we didn't have the forces, I don't know whether, is it entropy? Whatever it is, the forces trying to to deconstruct America, immigration actually would probably be less of a problem, but it's not immigration that's causing it. I mean, my mother was a daughter of immigrants who went to public school in the Boston area in 1930s and 40s, and her parents brought her to the school, and the unspoken deal was, here, Mr. School, you teach our daughter what it is to be an American. You know, we're taking her to church, and she's helping in the store, we're helping with all the family stuff. It's your job in the school to teach her about this new country of hers. We don't know anything about it, we just got here. Well, the Guatemalan woman bringing her kid to Los Angeles public schools is making the same implicit message. You know, we're dealing with our things at home. Here's our daughter. You need to teach her what it is to be in America. Well, my mom memorized the Gettysburg Address, sang Hail Columbia, and learned that George Washington was the father of our country. They're not teaching that in the Los Angeles public schools, and it's not the immigrants' fault. The immigrants, in a sense, are almost cannon fodder for those trying to deconstruct America. But cannon fodder itself does matter. And so until we put our own house in order, it's just not defensible to be bringing in 1 million people every year that we have to Americanize when we're not even doing that good job Americanizing our own children.
The next one. How will the collapse of fertility rates in most of the world, except for Africa, affect the way we think and talk about immigration in both the US and Europe?
It's the opposite of the way it's presented. It's often presented that fertility rates, birth rates are dropping, therefore we need more immigration to make up for the fact. It's kind of like what they're saying is that having babies is a job Americans won't do, so we need to import somebody else to do the job for them. I would actually say it's the exact opposite. In a society with a relatively healthy birth rate, immigration can be a supplement to population growth. You may or may not be a good idea, but the population is growing without the immigration. In a low fertility environment, immigration becomes a vehicle for replacement rather than replenishment, as it were. In other words, if you have 1.1 fertility, or well, that's even low by European standards, but I think Korea maybe has 0.9 fertility, whatever. You have low fertility, below replacement fertility, and you have relatively higher replacement fertility immigration, you really do end up kind of replacing the population. Now, I don't think it's some conspiracy, that George Soros and other people are in their magic, in their evil lair on the top of a mountain saying, let's replace the population. But that's the effect it has. It does, in fact, have the effect of population replacement when you have low fertility. That's why lower fertility actually, in my opinion, requires lower immigration so as to preserve the coherence of the society.
And can support provided to families be an alternative to importing population from other countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an immigration issue that we would study specifically, but yes, I mean, clearly, now I don't know how much of that works. You all are doing some in Hungary. It's not clear that pro-natalist policies work. I'm not even sure I'm pro-natalist. I mean, I have 3 kids. I'm not against babies. I'm all for babies. Everybody likes babies. I'm just not sure the government paying people to have babies is going to work or is a good idea. What I'm against, though, what I am for is I am anti-natalist. In other words, I think the government has a responsibility in trying to remove obstacles to people having the number of children they want to have. And there are a lot of obstacles like that. And if there's ways to do that, I'm all for them. But whether those work or not, I still don't think we should be having immigration. That might be a way to silence some of the lobbying for immigration as a replacement for babies. But and so that would be good in itself. But if fertility is low, immigration needs to stay low. Otherwise, you end up artificially through state policy radically changing the society in a way that would not have happened in a higher fertility society that had the same immigration.
Returning to the U.S., how do you see the role of Vice President Kamala Harris regarding migration issues? Could she make some agreements, negotiations with mid-American countries?
No. The White House initially wanted to make her immigration czar in general, or border czar. The vice president's staff said, no, I'm not touching that. That's a loser issue. You're not going to blame that on me. So that's why she said, no, I am root causes czar. In other words, she's in charge of this root causes idea you asked for before. And even that she hasn't really done anything on. So no, the vice president's role is essentially non-existent. It's just a political matter. And she's not even very good at politics. So, yeah, I don't think she has anything to contribute, honestly, to the immigration issue.
And what are the chances of states like Texas, Florida, etc., to stop immigration?
Limited. There's something states can do, but immigration is a federal issue. The governor of Texas has tried to take action on his own to try to limit the number of people coming to the United States. For instance, what they're doing is arresting some illegal immigrants for trespassing on private property or state land, because trespassing is a state offense. They can't arrest people for immigration violations because we have a federal system. It works differently in kind of unitary systems like most European countries. We have, the state authorities, the state police and the local police can only enforce state laws, but trespassing is a state offense. So in Texas, they're having agreements with some border landowners. They're saying, if illegals cross your land, can we arrest them and charge them with trespassing? And a lot of them say yes, they sign on. The problem is, you arrest them for trespassing, you lock them up for, say, 3 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever the term might be, then what do you do with them? If they're Mexican, maybe you can walk them to the border and push them across. If they're not Mexican, you'd have to give them to ICE, to the immigration authorities, and they're not going to deport them. So there's a limit to how much that's going to do. I'm afraid that actually some of the state government people are going farther. The Attorney General of Arizona, I think it was yesterday, issued a formal opinion, a legal memo, that the illegal immigration crisis across the border fit the Constitution's definition of an invasion. Because the Constitution says the federal government will defend states against invasion, and if not, the states can, in other words, it says states cannot wage war on their own, except in cases of invasion, when the federal government is not able to respond. And so what the Arizona Attorney General said is, this constitutes invasion under the Constitution, and we therefore are authorized to take actions to stop it. And I'm afraid that's going to blow up in our face. They're going to end up, somebody's going to get shot. That's going to then, I mean, it hasn't happened yet. They haven't deployed the National Guard armed, but nothing good comes from that sort of thing. The federal government needs to do its job. And I'm afraid that the states, when states are helping the federal government, when they're rowing in the same direction, as it were, they can be it can make a big difference. When the federal government is unwilling to enforce the borders of the United States, I don't know, I mean, there's a limit to what states can do. Ultimately, that's a political problem that the voters need to deal with by getting rid of the federal authorities that are leaving the border open.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us here today.
I got a little commercial here for the Center. Center for Immigration Studies. We're online at cis.org. And for people who like snark and sarcasm, I'm on Twitter at Mark S, as in Stephen, Mark S. Krikorian. Thank you to MCC. And
it's been our pleasure to welcome you here. Maybe this has been the most valuable part of today's event, but anyway, I think it was very useful, and thank you for sharing your valuable thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today, and I encourage you all to join us at later events in the future. Thank you very much.